And James Dorsey, who is joining us now, he's a senior contributor with InsideArabia.com, among many other things he does, like podcasts, and he's got his stuff all over the place. I wanted to get him on today because he had a story titled "Hedging Bets Turkey Positions Itself as Supply Chain Alternative to China." It's a great piece by James. This basically is being spearheaded by Lindsey Graham. Our rift with China is growing. So is there an alternative to them? Lindsey Graham thinks it's Turkey. Now, our relationship with them, as you know, has been frayed, but this could be the answer to making it better. They're a NATO ally. It should be better than it is. And to break this down for us, James Dorsey, live in Singapore. Hey, James, thanks for being with us, sir.
John, always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that gracious introduction.
Great, insightful. I gotta say, I don't mean to say this again, but a lot of my audience, I mean, you guys are intelligent. You follow this stuff. Dorsey's stuff it's really top-notch stuff. So go to InsideArabia.com. It's all there. Sign up for him. Tell us about Lindsey Graham's involvement and how Graham, as a chairman on the Foreign Relations Committee, how he is bringing Trump and Erdogan together, an opportunity here to replace China. How does this all work?
Well, I'm not sure it's Graham Lindsey who's bringing Trump and Erdogan together. Trump and Erdogan have a relationship, and somehow it's a personal relationship. And as often happens with Trump's conduct of foreign affairs is often very personal. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen over the last 2 months is that the Turkish-American Business Council, which is a affiliate of the largest and oldest business council in Turkey, has been lobbying Lindsey Graham, as well as Wilbur Ross and others, to look at Turkey as an alternative for supply chains, and possibly look at Turkey as a gateway, a U.S. gateway to Africa. So what happened is that the chairman of the Turkish American Business Council, Mehmet Ali Yalçındağ, wrote a letter to Lindsey Graham in March in which he put this proposition forward. He did it at the same time he wrote a letter to Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, mm-hmm. as well as other members of Trump's cabinet. And simultaneous with that, you had a former senator from Louisiana who was coming up for interests of the Louisiana energy industry, particularly the gas industry, lobbying for a relationship with Turkey. Now, all of this is coming to a head, if you wish, tomorrow in a webinar that is organized by the Turkish American Business Council, in which both Lindsey Graham and the former senator from Louisiana, David Vittner, if I'm not incorrect, are going to be the stars of the show.
What is the objective?
Well, Turkey's in a delicate position, if you wish. Its economy was already in problems prior to the coronavirus. Obviously, the coronavirus has accentuated those problems significantly. It's got a pandemic problem, as most other countries have. But on top of that, it also has, whatever you want to call it, a friendship, a partnership with Russia that is really built on short-term interests because their longer-term interests diverge. And you've seen that in Syria with Turkish forces clashing with the Russian-backed Syrian army of President Bashar al-Assad, and more recently and even more clearly in Libya, where the internationally recognized government of national accord, backed by Turkey, defeated the forces of the rebel leader Khalifa Haftar, which are backed by Russia. And in the process, it was Turkish electronic warfare, Turkish drones, that literally whacked Russian anti-missile defense systems.
When you say that Turkey has short-term interests with Russia, outline those for us.
Well, basically, Turkey is positioning itself as a regional power, if not eventually a global power. And to be fair to the Turks, Turkey is an economic powerhouse. and one that will be among the largest economies in the world within a decade or two. It has certainly regional ambitions. It is locked into a bitter rivalry with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. There's a whole Turkic world that stretches from Turkey across Asia into northwestern China. It's an Islamic powerhouse, and so it has regional ambitions. It also has security concerns. Clearly, Turkish perceptions, whether one agrees with that or not, of Kurdish aspirations is a concern, and Kurds are in southeastern Turkey. They constitute about 20% of the population of the country, but they're also on the other side of the border, both in Syria and Iraq. And so Turkey needed Russia in terms of rolling back the Kurdish forces in northern Syria that had been allied with the United States in the fight against the Islamic State, and then at basically Erdogan's request were abandoned by Trump. Russia's the major player in Syria, so it needs that alliance. Turkey's positions on many issues differ with those of the United States, even though Turkey is a NATO member, and therefore the relationship with Russia buys a degree of flexibility, ability to maneuver. But when it gets to on the ground, as we've seen in Syria and Libya, suddenly those interests do not necessarily converge.
We're with James Dorsey. He's live in Singapore. James is a senior contributor with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. That is my source for daily Middle Eastern news 7 days a week. Bookmark it. They're based in Washington, D.C., InsideArabia.com. James Dorsey, Singapore, one of their leading contributors, has a piece out. Hedging bets Turkey positions itself as a supply chain alternative to China. You said in your piece that one Turkish businessman said the growing rift between the U.S. and China creates a significant opportunity for geopolitical cooperation. Turkey and the United States would both benefit economically, no question. And, this is as I said, when I started, NATO member, longstanding relationship, James. In the best case scenario, name a couple of the key economic opportunities that the U.S. would have with Turkey as it relates to pulling away from our intertwined economic relationship with China, the decoupling, if you will, of the China economy, which I think is certainly if the president wins his second term, he's going to do that. So give us some specifics of how Turkey and the U.S. would benefit from a new enhanced relationship absent China.
A key issue, decoupling or not, is a diversification of global supply lines. Or global supply chains. That's the lesson that many have drawn out of the pandemic. Yep. Turkey has one of the most modern, if not the most modern, industrial base in Europe. It is a major exporter. You go look at the television market, for example, in Europe. Up to 30% of all television sets that are sold in Europe are, if not more, are manufactured in Turkey. The same goes for white goods, refrigerators, house appliances, what have you. Most likely you would see the similar figures also in the United States. So it has the infrastructure. Turkey, moreover, also has the network. Turkish Airlines is the airline that flies to the most destinations in the world. It has expanded the airlines network as well as the network of embassies and diplomatic missions in Africa extensively. So that's what Turkey wants to capitalize on. And, of course, it's very close to Europe. Now, there's another interest in all of this, too, which may be more of a European interest than an American interest, but nonetheless should be an American concern. And that is, and we've spoken a little bit about this in terms of China in the past, and that is the spheres of influence in the Mediterranean Sea. So if the Russians were to be successful, or if Khalifa Haftar were to be successful, then that would open the door to a Russian military base on the southern Mediterranean, which would be definitely a major concern to the Europeans and presumably also to the Americans. So you now have a situation in Libya where Turkey and Russia are key players in determining the future of this country. And which way Turkey goes will in part be a function of what its relationship is with others, primarily in this case, the United States and secondarily Europe.
Mm-hmm. That is so spot on. This relationship, it's an alternative, and it's almost like the president leveraging his personal relationships now with Erdogan needs them to fill the gap as he moves away from China. So you would think that that would strengthen the personal relationship between the two leaders. Am I right about that, James?
You're basically correct. There are a couple of things. One is Turkey's not the only player. There are other players like Vietnam, like India, which are angling for a similar position. Now, there's more room for more than one player. With other words, it's not a zero-sum game here. It's about diversification, and diversification means multiple players. The other part of this puzzle, if you wish, is that the relationship. If you go look at John Bolton's book, whatever you think of the book, but one of the issues that is raised in that book, and there's other evidence for that, was that Trump was inclined very early on already to help Erdogan squash, minimize whatever it was going to be, a legal case against a Turkish businessman and a Turkish state-run bank that was charged with evasion of Iran sanctions. Ultimately, there was the release of the American pastor from Turkish prison, which Trump welcomed. So there is this relationship. And what Erdogan, the Turkish president, is trying to do is capitalize on that relationship to, one, create economic opportunity, but also, on the other hand, reinforce Turkey's importance to the United States, if you wish.
Basically, the president, in his relations with Erdogan, overlooked the bank, the Turkish enterprise, that didn't adhere to the Iran sanctions. So he looked the other way on that and call it a deal, but the result of that, I think that's the better politically correct term, because we don't know. The result of that is the pastor gets released.
Let me, if I may interrupt, let me just correct. He did not overlook it. He expressed willingness, if he could. He hasn't been able to, because obviously the United States has an independent judiciary, and that
Right.
this is not the way legal matters are arranged.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that issue remains. There are other issues that are sore points to the Turks in terms of the relationship with the United States. But at the bottom line, I think what certainly Erdogan realizes is the strategic value of an improvement in relations with the United States, both strategically in terms of geopolitics, but also economically.
Where do we go from here? And then I do want to get to the Bolton book, but I've always thought the Trump-Erdogan, Turkish-U.S. relationship was strong. It's been, a little bit frayed, but I always thought eventually it would get back on track. And, one of the things James Dorsey, who's with us, James Dorsey, senior contributor for Inside Arabia, go to insidearabia.com. James Dorsey live in Singapore. He's a writer, investigative reporter, has a piece out, great piece, must read. Hedging bets Turkey positions itself as a supply chain alternative to China. Remember, it was the president that trusted Erdogan when he so-called took the troops out of Syria, and Erdogan, assured him there would not be a Kurd massacre and things of that nature. There was not. So the president trusted him on that. President was right, didn't happen, and I think he did the right thing by getting out of there, which is one of his campaign promises. The fact that the Turkish president owned up to the promises he made with the Kurds, has that helped the trust between the two leaders, you think?
I have no doubt about it. Look, I think that there are several things here. First of all, my impression is, and we may differ on this, but my impression is that Trump's assessment of his relationships with other leaders is a very personal one, and in many ways very different from the assessments that former presidents made about the relationships with foreign leaders. Trump clearly feels that he has a good relationship with Erdogan. And Erdogan clearly feels that if he handles Trump correctly, he can get quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's what the nature of the relationship is. Mm-hmm. I think what the problem on the U.S. part goes to a much larger issue. Mm-hmm. And that is that in a world in which we're getting a new world order, and how that will shape out, one needs to see, but there definitely will be new players. What we're seeing is a network of relationships between Turkey, Russia, China, and Iran that all of them, in my mind, are fragile. All of them are based on short-term interest, mm-hmm. and all of them are based on or involve longer-term differences. Mm-hmm. And for most of those countries, probably with the exception of China, just simply because of the size of China and what China represents, but for the other three, it's a hedging game in which they need to on the one hand, capitalize on that relationship, but also try and ensure that they don't become the secondary partner, the adjunct to, and so that's true, as much true for China, Russia, Iran as it is for Turkey. And Turkey is the country that probably at this point has gone the furthest in terms of manifesting that these relationships have limits.
It's hard to argue with Erdogan's mastery of media, of relationships. I mean, if you go back to the way that he handled the Khashoggi killing and how, that went on for months because like every 3 days they leaked something. It should be taught at Harvard Business School in media relations. The guy is savvy. I mean, there's no question about it. Getting back to China, we're with James Dorsey, senior contributor. Go to InsideArabia.com, based here in D.C. James, final question. If Trump gets a second term, and I still think he's going to win, they decouple from China, what does that do to the precarious CCP economy? I mean, what happens?
Well, we'll see. I mean, we've got an interesting situation. In fact, it's something that I'm going to be writing about in the next few days. So you have a world that has been economically battered, if not shattered, by the way the coronavirus was handled. Tens of emerging markets, developing countries, need debt relief. Mm-hmm. The Chinese, so far, have not been willing, except with the exception of the G20, have not been willing to look at the debt problem multilaterally. They're looking at it bilaterally, particularly in Africa, and have so far not given a lot of ground, with one exception. And that exception is Sri Lanka, a strategic island in the Indian Ocean.
Really?
Now, Sri Lanka's gotten in the last 2 months about $500 million in aid from China on a concessionary loan over 10 years. And it has gotten, to be fair, as many other countries have received, medical aid. Why did Sri Lanka get it? Because Sri Lanka, in the last 2 years, has gradually distanced itself from the United States. One of the things that happened in the last 2 years is that the Sri Lankans refused to renew a status of armed forces agreement with the United States.
Wow.
They haven't broken relations with the United States or anything, but they're doing much more of a balancing act. Now, the larger background to that is that there have been these accusations of debt diplomacy by the Chinese. To be honest, I'm not sure that there really is a deliberate debt diplomacy, and there aren't that many examples to prove that there is a debt diplomacy. But Sri Lanka was the one of the first and the largest case in which Chinese access to a port was, or stake in a port, was significantly increased because the Sri Lankans could not service their debt to China. So I think one should look at Sri Lanka in terms of the way, on the one hand, the way the Chinese are going to handle this, but on the other hand, obviously, China has a problem like many other developed countries will have in the fact that a lot of debt cannot be repaid at this point.
So then they take other measures that help them strategically position themselves going forward. You can't pay them. They get something they want. It's interesting. We don't quite operate that way, but look, that's what the CCP does. James, thank you. It's always great to have you live in Singapore. James Dorsey, thank you so much. I always learn so much when you're on, so insightful. Thank you for your time, sir.
It's vice versa, and it's always a pleasure to be with you, John. All the best.